Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast you really don't want to miss. I'm Suzanne Harris, and today you're going to get a sneak peek behind the scenes at what it's like to be an author. You'll hear the backstory behind their book, who or what inspires them, where their ideas come from, and, who knows, you might even get the inside scoop on a new project. If you want to know more about them and their work, we'll tell you where you can find more. Joining me today is Kathy Stauffer, and she's here to talk about her latest novel, Thou Shalt Not. Kathy, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Suzanne.
Now, I know a secret about you that you're going to tell our listeners, because I am always curious about how the writer becomes the writer. I always do my homework, and so I know what that backstory is. Let's tell our listeners how you first started writing.
Very interesting question. That goes back a long ways. 1960s, a college journalism class, and the world of written words and the creative possibilities just enlightened me. At the time, I experimented with poetry and writing short descriptive pieces. Had some published, but it was decades later, after teaching, actually raising children, having daycare in my house, on and on and on, that I was tempted or almost pulled to write a book. Because I thought, well, I would go to the library and take home books, 3 or 4 at a time. And if I couldn't get into them by the second chapter, I would take it back. And I started thinking, I can write a better book than this. I was very naive. I read somewhere that Somerset Maugham, I believe his name was, said there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. And I did not. So I guess I was on the right path there.
I know exactly what you mean. Had you never, prior to this class, felt the pull to do any kind of writing?
No, actually, no. I think in the school I did, mainly we wrote reports. I don't know if I ever even wrote a poem or any kind of descriptive writing in school. I went to a very small school. There were only 8 in my class when I was a junior. We consolidated, and I was so excited to start school because we'd have a bigger class. We had a class of 26. But I only remember writing reports. I don't remember writing anything that I would consider now to be really fun.
What did the college teacher do that prized the lid off of that creativity? Just give you the opportunity to write in a creative way?
Actually, it was a journalism class that was more about newspaper writing than creative writing. But for some reason, and I can still picture him being in front of the classroom. It's like a little old man kind of slumped over with a gray beard. Maybe it was just his mannerisms. I don't know, but we mainly wrote newspaper articles, but I started experimenting with words and also reading the poetry or the college anthology, the local college anthology that was published each year. Funny story, I sent an article into a newspaper. It wasn't an article, it was poetry. And I thought, they'll never publish this. And they did, and it frightened me. All of a sudden, I felt very vulnerable. And I sent a letter to the newspaper and said, I didn't give you permission to publish this. And they sent a letter back and said, well, you sent it to us. We asked for whatever submissions. But I think it was the feeling that I had put myself out there, my vulnerability or some rawness in the poem. And I probably sent it in because I wanted some affirmation of what I was writing. Was it worthy? Was it good? And then they published, and it like knocked my socks off.
I love that
so
story. I love that story. And the naivete that you just expressed is wonderful. You sent it in with really no expectation that anything would happen. And then, there it is in the paper. Wait a minute. What do you mean? You published this?
Yes. actually, that same thing, similar thing happened many decades later. Here we go from college to 2008. One of my writer friends gave my name to a newspaper reporter in a larger nearby town because he was doing articles on, what generation do they call it that we come from?
Boomers?
Baby boomer, on writers. And so he called me and asked about my poetry and said, what's your upcoming project? And I said, well, I've started a book. And I told him a little bit about that. And he said, why don't you send a photo? He said, I don't know if we'll use your information or not. And so here, me again, in my naivete, thinking, they're not going to write about me. It comes out in the Sunday paper on the front page of the search section, a certain section of the paper. Here's my picture along with a professor from a college, and Stephen King.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes. And so it's like telling people you're going on a diet and, still being 50 pounds overweight. So weeks later or a couple of months later, it's like I told people I was going to write a book. Now I have to. Another thing that kind of knocked my socks off.
Kathy, I love it. I hope that if we have people who are listening to us right now, and if they have had the same thought, I think I can write a book, I hope that your story will encourage somebody to actually put their foot out there and actually take that step forward and really write that book. Now, there are always, I've discovered this is so funny. I'm about to say something that's so obvious, but it never occurred to me until one day I finished doing an interview with someone, and all of a sudden I thought to myself, all books have two stories. There's the story that the reader gets when they read the book from cover to cover. But then there's always that story that's behind the book. Now, your writing is very interesting because it's classified as historic fiction or historical fiction. But your approach is very different than anybody else's approach that I've heard. Because of how you do this, tell our listeners a little bit about how you approached Thou Shalt Not.
Well, actually, Thou Shalt Not came to me, sort of, in that I had 1, 2, 3 books under my belt. They were not perfect. They were not well edited. It was a huge learning curve. I'm still learning. With the technology, the publishing world has been turned upside down. I read somewhere that there are like 10,000 books that are published in the United States every single day of the week. And so for a person to get their book out there, it's pretty difficult. But still, as you have just said, if you feel a pull to write a book, then sit down, do it, because you have a message that only you can tell, and it's going to connect with someone. So after these 1, 2, 3 books, and if not for those 1, 2, 3 books, this person would never have contacted me. I got a call from a local historian who said, do I have a story for you? And she said, I have all of the newspaper articles from a murder that happened in Mitchell County, our county, over 100 years ago. It was the first and only murder in Mitchell County for over 100 years. She said it would be historical fiction. And she said, please come to my house, sit down. She said, I'll share the articles with you. And I wanted to say to her, I don't do research. I make stuff up and I put it in books. But I felt like I needed to honor her request. So I showed up at her house. Her mother was there in her 80s at the time. I sat down on the oilcloth, little kind of sticky table, old-fashioned house. And she brings out these copies that she had run off using micro fish. Is that the way you say it? Microfiche?
Yeah.
And kind of scattered. They weren't even in order. And she sent them home with me. I stuck them under my bed. I put them behind a dresser. I didn't want to look at it because then I'd have to do something with it. I finally pulled them out, made a timeline, and it was Mary Meier who pulled me into the story. And she is what we would probably call the protagonist of the book.
You just gave me chills because this book, although it's fiction, it's based on reality. These were real people. These were real conversations that took place. This is more real than made up in a way.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Exactly. Yes, it's fair. Mary Meier, protagonist, her husband Henry. We have Ella, Eddie, and Will. These are actual people. They're children. DeForest Fairbanks was a person who lived in that town. David McLaughlin was the founder of the town that came in with the railroad and went out with the railroad. It only existed about 40 years, population probably of 75. However, with a wicker chair factory, shoe shop, dentist, harness repair, creamery and co-op, blacksmith, butcher, lumber yard, general store, of course, got to have that, postmaster, hotel, which was run by Mary and Henry Meier and their children. And so that's where most of the story takes place. George Robbins, blacksmith, Mr. and Mrs. Port ran the general store. Miss Jenny Bloomhagen had a dress shop. The Reverend is fictional because why is the Reverend fictional? Because he was never mentioned in any of the court documents that were printed in the newspapers at the time. The David Community Church still exists today amidst cornfields and bean fields and a large farm that's probably 50 yards away. That's all that exists anymore of the little town of David. They picked up the railroad tracks. It's on a dusty gravel road. What is interesting to me is that the signpost, which they put up, I don't know how many years ago, says Shadow Avenue. Now, who came up with that?
Wow.
Because they're usually, in alphabetical order our street or road signs are. And I thought it was really interesting that someone came up with Shadow Avenue. And then we have Mr. Eaton, who was the defense attorney, and Mr. Lovejoy, who was the prosecuting attorney. Those were all very real people.
This was a living, breathing, alive with all of those people you just mentioned place. And now it's just gone.
Yes.
Except for the church.
Except for the church. They still have services every Sunday in summertime because there is no heat in the church and there's no plumbing in the church. This is a fun little story also. I was there a couple of weeks ago to be their visitor speaker. They have a speaker that they invite for their Ladies Visitors Day once a summer. And 8 years or several years after the book came out, I'm invited to be the speaker. So it was a good day for me, but of course, when you talk, at least for me, I always need to go to the bathroom before I speak, and I had to go to an outhouse.
No.
Because there's no plumbing inside.
Kathy, you're making that up. Are you serious?
No, I'm not. And the ladies who bring the salads, they bring large containers or thermoses of hot soapy water to be able to wash their dishes and keep their hands clean while they're serving the meal. So it was quite an experience.
Did you have any sense of any of the people? I mean, was there any kind of sort of deja vu feeling about the place because of the story in the book?
A little bit, but also behind that, you say the story behind the story, and that is so huge because there's a story behind the story, and then there's the stories behind the story, and there are so many. One of the things that I realized when giving the talk at this church is that there were like 4 or 5 women that were instrumental in encouraging me to write this, get the information to me, help with editing. These people are all gone. They've all passed. And I think that's what sent shivers down kind of everybody's skin when I mentioned that, is because these were all ladies that these ladies knew and worked with and went to church with and visited with and socialized with. And time, and none of it was due to the pandemic. It was just getting older, sicknesses, that kind of thing which also